Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. We have set up this event thanks to the sponsorship of Elliot Salloway, who is the founder of Project Exodus. Unfortunately, Elliot can't be with us tonight because he's on a plane flying to Japan. Tonight is gonna be a discussion around what is happening in the Ukraine with the current Russian occupation of Crimea. We have a very distinguished set of guests who are experts in the area of foreign policy, American foreign policy and international affairs, so we look forward to hearing from them and to discussing what is happening in the Ukraine and how we can make sense of it. One of the things that we want to look at is at lessons from the past. Russia has in 2008 had a short war with its neighboring country Georgia over the regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and that is one precedent that we'll be looking at and see if and what relevance that bears on today's situation in the Ukraine. We will also be looking at other examples such as the Spratly Islands in Vietnam in 1988, when the Spratly Island massacre happened, when the Chinese army killed 64 Vietnamese soldiers on the Spratly Islands. And that's another example on a different scale that had different implications, but it is a situation that bears some resemblance with what is happening in the Ukraine. An interesting talking point might also be looking at other situations. There are countries in Europe that this year will vote on seceding from their country that they belong to. So we have Scotland that is voting in a referendum to secede from Great Britain, and then we have Catalonia in Spain, who is also considering in a referendum the option of separating itself from Spain. So these are going to be interesting talking points. But one of the most interesting points that we will also try to focus on is to try to understand the motivations behind the actions of the players in this situation. What motivated Russia to act the way it did? What motivated the Ukraine to act the way it did when it first tried to remove Russian as an official language and only keep Ukrainian as the official language on the country, thus upsetting its Russian population? What are the motivations of the European Union? What are the motivations of the United States? So it'll be interesting to really try to understand where each player comes from and what is motivating them to act in the way they do. So that being said, we will now kick off the event with some music played by Julie Levin, who is a violinist and the founder and executive director of Shelter Music Boston. And I will now pass it on to Julie, who will briefly introduce her work and then play some music for us. Thank you for being with us.
say a few introductory things about.
You're not going to be Russia on this Ukrainian table.
No, I'm going to try to explain what I think is going on, and I'll give a few thoughts on how I think this would be most easily resolved. But I'm not, at this point, all that optimistic that that's going to happen. First thing I would say is that this has to be understood as a primarily geopolitical conflict. That the root of this is geopolitics. It's not economics. It's not legality. It's not human rights. It's not, I think, domestic politics in the United States or in Russia or anywhere else. It's primarily a geopolitical quarrel. And no matter how we feel about what Russia may be doing, it's very important to understand exactly why they're acting as they are, because if we try to get them to change their behavior, you have to figure out what's making them do this in the first place. Right? And my interpretation of what's happened here is that the events in Ukraine, starting last fall, have appeared to Moscow as the latest in a series of Western their security sphere, right? And they have been trying to establish for quite some time now that there was a limit to how far that could go, and in this case they saw it as going too far. So just a little bit of history here. Russia, unlike the United States, is a country that has been invaded frequently. The United States was last invaded in 1812, more than 200 years ago. Right? We've never actually been really attacked. 9/11 notwithstanding and Pearl Harbor notwithstanding, the continental United States has never suffered the kind of outside attack that most other major powers have dealt with. You know, think of the Blitz in London, the 20 million Russians or people in the Soviet Union who died in World War II. Nothing like that has happened here. The Soviet Union or Russia was invaded by Napoleon, invaded by Germany in World War I, invaded by Hitler in World War II. They are understandably very sensitive about the countries they might have on their borders. Since 1992, when the Soviet Union fell apart, and again I'm giving you how this looks from Moscow, not whether it's right or wrong, they see a steady progression eastward of a set of institutions led by the most powerful country on earth, us. Right? And there's a debate amongst historians as to whether or not the first Bush administration gave Gorbachev some assurances that we wouldn't move NATO eastwards. There's an argument about whether or not. We clearly did not make a ironclad, write it down and sign it type of guarantee, but there were some statements made by some American officials that the Russians clearly heard as statements we wouldn't move NATO east. Well, we ended up doing that. Germany reunified, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic came in, the Baltic states came in, and in 2008, the second President Bush proposed a so-called action plan for both Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. That's sort of the first step to getting into NATO. Shortly thereafter was the Russo-Georgian War of 2008, and as Jonas said earlier, that's the point at which the Russians occupied South Ossetia and Abkhazia and delivered a sort of sharp rap to Georgian ambitions and made it very clear that further expansion of NATO eastwards was something they were going to resist with everything they could think of. Now, what's happened in Ukraine is, of course, there was an EU economic plan which Putin didn't like. So he upped the ante by offering Yanukovych, the previous leader, a better deal, more money, fewer terms, etc., and probably leaned on him in some other ways. Yanukovych then essentially erased the EU plan, took the Russian plan, and that was one of many things, including his own incompetence and corruption, that started the uprisings against him in Ukraine. ground view of those uprisings was that they were obviously not caused by the United States. This was not some dastardly Western plot or anything like that. However, the United States clearly tilted in favor of the demonstrators, and did so even after the February 20th agreement that had been worked out by the EU to try and resolve this problem, which was rejected by the demonstrators in Maidan, some of whom, not the majority, but some of whom are really quite unsavory characters. Right? And at that point, the American Secretary of State, Assistant Secretary of State for Eurasian Affairs, Victoria Nuland, and the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine both made various statements, either publicly or in her case, on her cell phone, that clearly indicated that we were trying to shape events and we were wanting Yanukovych to leave and be replaced by the man who is now the interim prime minister. Whether that was the right thing or not to do, I personally think it was a mistake. But that was seen in Moscow as the latest in a long series of American/Western efforts to pull Ukraine into the Western orbit. Right? And at that point, Putin responded as he has. I think it was a huge mistake on our part not to anticipate that he was going to react this strongly, given what they had done in 2008, and given that Ukraine is much more important than Georgia was. The question now is, of course, what to do about it. A couple of things. One is, this is an issue that Russia cares far more about than the United States, because Ukraine is right next door to Russia. There are historic ties there. There are some Russian language speakers, and we may care to some degree about Ukraine's fate, but it's going to matter much more to Russia. And therefore, if this gets into a wrestling match where we start punishing them and they start punishing us, they're going to be willing to pay a much larger price than we are likely to be willing to pay. And I think that also applies to Western Europe as well. Western Europe currently gets about 30% of its energy consumption in the form of Russian oil and gas, mostly gas. Some countries it's even higher than that. And that's not a terrible lever of Russian influence right now, because Europe's had a mild winter and their gas stockpiles are pretty high. But over time, if the price goes up or if Russia starts playing around with the gas supply, this is something that countries like Germany, some of the Baltic states, and others are really going to feel. And especially Ukraine, which is very dependent on energy supplies from Russia. So we have to be careful that if we start down the road of punishing Russia, they have ways of responding that our allies aren't going to like and that we're not going to like. My own view, and I'll wrap up with this, is that the primary U.S. goal should be sort of three things. First, defend the territorial integrity of Ukraine, hopefully including Crimea, but not necessarily including Crimea, but discourage any further Russian move into the eastern part of Ukraine. Second, reestablish Ukrainian neutrality. Ukraine will be a buffer state between East and West. It will not become part of NATO. It might, some point down the road, have an association with the European Union, but the last thing the European Union needs right now is another country that is in desperate need of an economic bailout. The Ukrainian estimate is that they need $35 billion, and that's not something Europe wants to shoulder the burden on right now. So we reestablish Ukraine as a neutral state between East and West. It will not be part of the Russian sphere of influence. It will not be part of our sphere of influence. And that's better for us. It's ultimately better for the Ukrainians, because if they start heading towards the West, Russia will do lots of things to hurt them, right? And ultimately that's better for Russia too, because dividing up Ukraine will, I think, be a source of much trouble between us and the Russians. So if I were doing this, I would be trying to reassure the Russians that we're not trying to incorporate Ukraine, go so far as to make some guarantees that we're not going to do that henceforth, and try to get this settled as quickly as possible, because that's going to be better for all concerned. I will leave it there, and you can all tell me where I'm wrong.
A question rather than a statement. So, at the level of, I guess I see this argument at the level of geopolitics. But if you know, where one is talking about Ukraine as if it's a thing that you can make decisions about from the outside, or something like that. But if one is Ukrainian and try to figure these things out, what is it that it means? What does it mean to be neutral? What does it mean to not be incorporated? What does it mean, you know, in practical terms? Does that say something about responses to I don't know, influence from one side or the other, or is that compatible with some increasing democracy or some attempts to root out corruption, or any of those sort of more internal, domestic?
Well, most of Ukraine's problems in the last 20 years have been self-inflicted, right? The political system, after they gained independence, did not perform particularly well. They've had a series of not very competent, not very honest leaders, and that's quite unfortunate from the perspective of the Ukrainian people. And so much of the unhappiness is generated by that. Their economic growth has been very slow, almost flat. As we now know from seeing Yanukovych's palace, lots of money getting siphoned off, but he wasn't the first, right? His predecessors did much the same thing. So obviously any process that brought better government to Ukraine would be to every Ukrainian's benefit, and we should be willing to help with that. But it also means that Ukrainians understanding that, due to the nature of history, they are in a particular location, and therefore they're next to a very powerful neighbor that would care about their alignment. And the last thing that Russia wants to see is a Ukraine that over time gravitates into NATO, and therefore has an implicit American security guarantee. And by the way, what's compounded this, of course, is the United States didn't just extend security guarantees to Eastern European countries. We also began talking about putting missile defenses in Poland and elsewhere. And we said, well, these are really about Iran. But the Russian view is, look, Iran doesn't even have any nuclear weapons, and it doesn't have long-range missiles that could strike here. So why are you putting these missile defenses there? Is there another country that they might conceivably be directed at? And of course, they see it as them. No. We also ought to just bear in mind that the United States for a couple of hundred years has had this thing called the Monroe Doctrine, where we declared no other great powers were supposed to be involved in a significant security partnership in the Western Hemisphere. And we did a lot of pretty nasty things to prevent things like that from happening. Right? And if we can do that, then it shouldn't surprise us that Russia, particularly given its history, would do similar things. Again, I'm not necessarily defending them, I'm just trying to understand them. But I think we certainly do not want to accept an arrangement where Ukraine is falls under such Russian influence that they're not allowed to have economic dealings with us, not allowed to have trade or investment coming from Europe or whatever. That's unacceptable to us. But at the same time, we may have to accept some limits on the other commitments. And I always like to remind people, just because some country really wants to have American protection doesn't mean it's in our interest to give it, and sometimes it may not even be in their interest for us to give it if it's not something we can credibly defend.
What would you say about Russia's expansionist history? Do you think that is in Russia's DNA, that they want to look at expansion? I mean, Putin considers the fall of the Soviet Union the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. I don't know how much of that is propaganda to reel off his people and then gather support. But how much does that play a part in this?
I'm not particularly concerned about it for a couple of reasons. One is, I see the Russian response here as primarily a defensive reaction. It was not that they had been threatening to go after Ukraine for the last 5 years and finally chose this moment to do it. This is not a replay of the 1930s, and Putin, who's not my favorite human being, is not Adolf Hitler. But secondly, Russia's long-term power position, both in terms of demography and economics, is not very promising. The Russian population is getting older quite rapidly. It's also shrinking, maybe down under 100 million people by 2050 or so. So the long-term power is going to be declining. And what's happening in global energy markets now, particularly what's happening here in the United States with hydraulic fracking and things like that, is likely to put Russia in a real economic bind, and not immediately, but in the next decade or two. And in fact, I've occasionally wondered if Putin is doing this now because if he were to try it 10 years from now, it wouldn't be possible. Right? So I'm not worried about Russia sort of re-emerging as a rival. I am worried about having a sufficiently bad relationship with them that we can't get their cooperation on other issues, whether it's Iran or Syria or China or whatever. We don't want a situation where this very large, if ultimately not that powerful country, is at odds with us forever, particularly if there's a solution that satisfies their minimum needs and doesn't require us to sort of sell anybody down the river. I think that's possible, and I'm not sure we're going to get there.
What do you fear might happen?
Well, what might happen is, what worries me most is the prospect of, given how dysfunctional the Ukrainian political system is, and given that there are some extremists at several ends there, that you start getting sort of low-level violence of different kinds. Some people going out and beating up a bunch of ethnic Russians, or a bunch of pro-Putin people going and finding some Ukrainians and shooting them or whatever. And that becomes a pretext for Russia to then do more, right? And they go into eastern Ukraine. That's not it. Crimea was easy, small, predominantly Russian, about 60% ethnic Russian. Eastern Ukraine has more Russians than the rest of the country, but it's not, for the most part, majority Russian. So that could actually be real trouble, right? And at that point, they start to resist. What I worry about is that then at that point, the western part of Ukraine really wants to go with the West, and we say yes. The eastern part goes with Russia, and suddenly, hi.
How are you, Steve? I haven't seen you in a lot of years. For anybody who doesn't already know, this is the man who called the Iraq War the right way. And I'm a Republican, saying
in any case, and that, by the way, puts then NATO and Russia sharing a long and fairly consequential border, which is not a good thing either. That's again why I like the idea of Ukraine as a buffer state.
So would you like to see NATO playing a smaller role in Eastern Europe?
No, I mean, I think having made these commitments, you can't throw people out unless they misbehave in some consequential way. Whether we should have done it again is that's a separate question. But having extended those treaty relations, I think we have to honor them. But I do think what worries me actually on our side is the rhetoric that people seem to very quickly gravitate to the rhetoric of threats and going to put pressure, and this is unacceptable. And to declare, for example, that this referendum over the weekend is illegal and illegitimate and invalid, all true, but just complaining about it is not a policy. Right? We can denounce it as many times, but that doesn't resolve the issue. And I gather the talks between Kerry and the Foreign Minister Lavrov did not go well today, but we don't know what was actually said.
No common vision.
Yes, that was Lavrov's, which actually worries me. That the Russians, have a view of how we got into this and what's at stake, and we're not showing any sort of empathy for what their view is. We don't have to like what they've done, but we at least ought to be trying to figure out what their view of it is, and it's pretty clear that that didn't sound. I mean, he also said that no threats were made, and that's, I think, a good sign, but I don't think we're being particularly creative about how to resolve this.
what have you heard as far as the reasons? Granted, I've missed a lot here.
Yeah.
What industry that they feel is theirs and the rest, but any
Yeah,
particular...
I said at the outset that I think this has to be seen as sort of a geopolitical problem, and it was driven by the Russian perception that the United States and NATO has been expanding steadily eastward since 1992, and we have gone far enough, and they regard keeping Ukraine from joining NATO as a vital national security interest, and they will therefore go to considerable lengths and suffer considerable pain to prevent that from happening. And that's the taproot of this. And therefore, the way to get out of it is to, and in addition, keep them from trying to control more parts of Ukraine, is by finding ways to reassure them that no, we don't care how often Ukraine says it wants into NATO, the door is closed and will remain closed for the foreseeable future.
Prior to now, have they made that clear?
No, we've done quite the opposite. In fact, in 2008, we the United States, over some European objections, by the way, we formally proposed a so-called action plan that would have brought Ukraine and Georgia into NATO over time. It was not an initial offer of membership. It's like, here, it's a little bit like a trial membership at a club. You know, try it out a couple of times. We'll start meeting the requirements. We'll check your bank account later, see if you qualify. It's a little bit like that, sort of a first step, and the Russians reacted very strongly to that.
What's your sense of the day-to-day consequences on the street and the lives of ordinary people of an alliance more with the EU or with Russia?
Well, that raises actually a very interesting question, because what I have dodged up until now is the question of what should Ukraine's relationship with the European Union be, right? And you know, and as I said, that's where this started. Is when the EU initially began this association agreement with Ukraine. If we can get the current problems resolved, Ukraine should be able to have economic ties with whoever it wants. And the question is whether or not we can, over time, you know, sort of lower the temperature enough that Russia no longer sees a closer tie to the EU as a potential threat, or whatever. I think, as a practical matter, I would be telling the EU, you want to go slow on this right now. You don't want to get too close to Ukraine, because Ukraine is a mess, and it needs to get fixed internally first. But you know, down the road, certainly trade agreements should be a possibility. We don't want a situation where Ukraine feels it can't extend economic ties. That ultimately, that's going to be part of its economic future too.
I guess I'm asking you to push down to a lower level of the Ukrainian street, if you will, in terms of consequences of employment, everyday economic livelihood. What are the stakes?
I think most of it, you're almost got to the limit of my expertise here. Ukraine's most primary problems are internal. Right? It's, you know, it has some old Soviet-era industries that are not competitive. It's incredibly corrupt. It's got some agriculture that needs investment. There are some raw materials that could be developed, but not a huge number of them. But it badly needs fixing, and you know, they're trying to get a rescue package through the IMF, but that will be a rescue package that comes with lots of conditions attached to it. And some of those conditions are going to be quite painful. So right now, energy prices are heavily subsidized for ordinary Ukrainians. And one of the first things the IMF is going to say is, all right, you're going to have to let those prices start going up closer to market prices. You're wasting energy, you're doing a variety of things. So one of the big problems that the new interim prime minister or his successor, once they hold elections, is going to face is how you simultaneously retain your popularity and inflict a lot of economic pain on your own population. Also, this is not exactly the geopolitical climate in which it's easy to attract foreign investment. I mean, would you take part of your retirement and put it into a Ukrainian industry or a Ukrainian startup? Probably you might wait a year or so.
We actually hosted the president, the ousted president of Ukraine in September with that exact goal in mind, trying to engage him. He made a speech.
How'd it go?
Yeah. How was the speech?
Yeah. And what was the result?
It was him and his head of investing promotion. And it was, you know, when people were wondering whether he was going to move towards Europe or what he was going to do. And he gave every signal that he was going to go towards Europe, and he talked about all the reforms they were going to implement. And the minister did a very good job of being very concrete with what they wanted to try to do. And, you know, it seemed that they were on a way west, if you will. And so the summary of a lot of the people that we had there was, you know, certainly frontier market in the middle of Europe, but, you know, it could be worth looking at. And we had another investor from the Middle East that was there who, after the speech, pulled out because he saw something different. So, you know, everybody kind of had their own interpretation on what they were trying to do. You know, I don't know what all of their different investment criteria were. But he stood up in front of everybody, took the heat, which, you know, I was kind of surprised by.
Yeah. No, and I think one of the problems that Ukraine has, right, is that Russia does have lots of ways of making trouble for Ukraine if they don't like its direction, partly because of the dependence on Russian energy and the fact that a lot of that energy flows, that goes to Western Europe, flows in pipelines that go through Ukraine. So, you know, if the Ukrainian government in Kiev is moving in a direction that Moscow really doesn't like, they
and an uninterrupted possession, Vietnam has been exercising its sovereignty over the Spratly Islands in the East Vietnam Sea, which is also known as the South China Sea. However, with continuing ambition for Germany to control natural resources as well as sea transportation routes, China has brutally and inhumanly attacked Vietnam, seriously violating Vietnam's sovereignty and international laws. This rude footage, which was taken by the China Navy during the invasion of the Spratly Islands on March 14, 1988, is an irrefutable proof of China Navy's crime. Using overwhelming armed forces, the China Navy killed 64 under-equipped Vietnamese sailors, destroyed and prevented unarmed Vietnamese vessels from saving the injured. The defending battle lasted for a few hours and 3 rifts nearby the island called Sin Cao, one of the largest islands in the Spratly Islands. Spratly Islands, located at a distance over 1,000 kilometers far from the undermost Chinese coast at Hainan Island, and rightly belonged to Vietnam for historical reasons. In the early months of 1988, the Chinese Navy had landed troops on 5 reefs and atolls of the Spratly Islands. 3 of them lie quite near the large islands that Vietnam owns. The Vietnamese Navy then buried supplies and equipment to 6 other reefs and atolls. It successfully gained control of them and prevented the Chinese Navy from extending their occupied zone into the other islands. In early March, the High Commander of Vietnamese Navy decided to defend other 3 rifts because they were parts of Spratly Islands and forming an open chain of rifts around Seacombe Island that were in control of Vietnam. On March 13, in the late evening, 3 Vietnamese transport ships arrived in time at those reefs and set up the flag to represent Vietnam's sovereignty over them. However, some hours after the Vietnamese transport ships reached the target, 4 large Chinese warships got close to the Vietnamese and switched on the warning loudspeaker. Despite threat from the Chinese warships, the Vietnamese transport ships patiently kept anchoring beside the reefs. They were not powerful enough to confront with the Chinese Navy and didn't want to escalate the conflict. The Chinese were ordered to take an off 40-footed motorboats with many heavy armed marines in carrying out a conspiracy to provoke the Vietnamese to break out of war. The Chinese, especially soldiers, are taught that the ocean area of Spratly Islands, with more than 200 islands, reefs, and atolls, belongs to China. continued until the next morning, when the Chinese mobilized more battleships and also more floating motorboats. They caused more provocations for the battle to break out. By 6 a.m., the settlers sent 3 aluminum boats that carried about 40 armed marines and rapidly rushed towards the reefs. They landed troops in front of Vietnamese sailor crews and tried to lower the Vietnamese flags that had been already planted into the reef platform since the last evening. Standing on the reefs where the water level covered half their bodies, the Vietnamese sailors set up commanding positions along the edge of the reefs to lay the defending lines and tried to prevent the enemy from advancing forward. They were threatened by the Chinese to retreat from the reefs. This intrusion caused strong reaction from the Vietnamese defenders to hold their flag. They determined to hold on to the reef and keep their flag flying at any cost. But unable to force the Vietnamese to leave the reef, the Chinese Marines had to get back to their battleships. And finally, just because the Vietnamese Navy had refused to withdraw from the reef, the Chinese used battleship for firing with 37mm anti-aircraft guns directly at the unarmed and light-armed Vietnamese sailors on the reefs, who were not able to attack them for their defending positions. They also fired fiercely with a 100mm gun on the 3 Vietnamese transport ships. 2 of them sank. Eventually, Vietnam defended successfully the sovereignty over 2 reefs on that day. China has occupied the other ones since the incident. 64 Vietnamese sailors and officers sacrificed their lives. Among them, 3 corpses were found after the end of the battle. 61 other persons were still missing and reputedly dead.
They just stood there in the water.
Yes.
They were on the reef. They were standing on the reef.
Yeah.
So,
Who produced this video?
From China. I think that is from China. The original video will be from China.
A dissident group in China.
I don't know. Maybe. Yes. Because they take video from China side.
Yeah.
Not from
Do
Vietnam
you
side.
know how they got it? How did you get access to Chinese video?
I don't know. Recently, I don't know.
I think just think about this situation.
Yes.
Right now, we still, I think, just last week, the foreign minister of China still mentioned about rich and small country. So in the 21st century, some rich countries still, yes, consider they are big. And so one is the situation of some countries like Ukraine or Vietnam and other countries. So at the 21st century, and still have attacked or invaded by some country like Russia or China. Or in this case, so if we look at the situation of Ukraine, so what would happen if Ukraine in a very neutral situation, not try to closer to the West, or not try to closer to Russia? So it would be safer or less in that case. So because right now, because we know a lot of countries happening. They change the government and some try to closer to become democratic country and some try to closer to their neighbors with some other type of government. So what should we do in the 21st century to protect or to bring justice to maybe less powerful country in this situation?
I will have to leave in about 5 minutes to go to another engagement that I agreed 2 months ago. A couple of things. One is that I think one has to look at these situations sort of on a case-by-case basis, that what works for one country, given its circumstances, may not be what will work for others. We do have in history a number of cases of countries that have adopted or had adopted for them effectively positions of neutrality. Austria, throughout the Cold War, by the Austrian State Treaty of 1954, agreed to be formally neutral in the Cold War. It was never part of NATO, it was never part of the Warsaw Pact. And Austria did okay. Both sides respected that. You know, Switzerland has been neutral for centuries and has always stayed out. Now, not every country is like Switzerland and can get away with this, but they did.
Is that tied to good scheme or good banking?
Yeah. Well,
Probably both.
and the fact that they took a variety of steps to make themselves hard to swallow. Right? It was always understood that you could conquer Switzerland if you really wanted to, but it wasn't really worth it, and the Swiss wouldn't do anything to provoke you either. So you might as well just leave it alone. And you could make, Sweden was clearly aligned economically and for the most part politically with the West, but was never a member of NATO. Took a neutral position as well and had been neutral previously. Finland was neutral formally, but tilted slightly, not by affection, but as a matter of practical politics towards Russia during the Cold War. Because we have a number of cases like that. To be slightly more provocative, there have been several articles published in the last week or so pointing out that, wondering whether Ukraine now regrets giving up the nuclear weapons that it had on its territory when the Soviet Union broke up. They had a few hundred, at least, Soviet-era nuclear weapons and missiles stationed on Ukrainian territory, and the United States went to enormous lengths in collaboration with the Russian government to convince Ukraine to give them up. I think we took Ukraine's arm and twisted it right out of the socket and offered them lots of money. Right? We'll pay for them, we'll buy them from you, but if you don't, lots of bad things will happen. But I do wonder if there are some Ukrainians in Kiev saying, if we still had a bunch of those things lying around, they would not have taken Crimea.
Exactly.
So I'm not suggesting that Vietnam should immediately go out and get nuclear weapons, by the way. But it does suggest, I think, that different countries, depending on who are the powerful countries nearby, have to think about different strategies for how they are going to retain their independence.
So your advice to Iran is they need to get a nuclear weapon then?
Actually, my advice to Iran is that they should get close but not cross the line, and that's exactly what they've done. Not cross the line. They'd actually, I think, that would cost them more than they would gain from it. In part because some other neighbors might imitate them, and they ultimately will be better served by doing what I think they are now trying to do, or at least some Iranians are trying to do, which is essentially reintegrate back into the international community, no longer be treated as a pariah state, and fix their own economy, which is in bad shape.
So I think that in this case, if we look at the situation now, right now it is very difficult to convince North Korea to give up its nuclear program.
I agree completely, and in fact, if you think about it, the lesson that North Korea would draw from events of the past decade is not encouraging. Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction and is now gone. Right? Muammar Gaddafi gave up the not very well developed nuclear, chemical, etc. He hadn't gotten very far, but he did have a program that he'd gotten from Pakistan. He gave it up, and look where he is today. So, the lesson that we have, I think, unintentionally been communicating to some of these countries is, gee, if all you want to do is stay in power, this is a good thing to have. is not necessarily the message we wanted to send.
I don't know if these are exactly, if it's exactly a counterexample, but some have given up nuclear weapons, haven't they?
Yeah.
South Africa.
South Africa did, and to its benefit. Right? And a fairly significant number of countries had programs that hadn't gotten all the way across. The Swedes had an active program for a long time. Germany was actually sort of seriously interested in going down the nuclear, West Germany, in the 1960s, and it was a source of much tension between the United States and West Germany. We did not want them to cross. And eventually they agreed not to. Argentina and Brazil both had active nuclear research programs that clearly looked like they were headed across the line, and they were persuaded ultimately to sort of simultaneously both back away. But none of them had actually gotten across. The post-Soviet republics, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan and South Africa are the only countries that actually had nuclear weapons under their control and agreed to give them up for different reasons.
So in this case, what the implication for less powerful country after the Ukraine situation? Try to go to the ambulance or try to find some way to help?
Well, I think it depends. Again, as I said, it depends very much on each country's situation. Do they face a powerful state that clearly is interested in trying to change the status quo? As I indicated before, I don't think Russia was trying to alter the situation in Ukraine a year ago. I don't think they had ambitions. I don't think Putin was sitting at night looking at maps of Crimea and saying, gee, I'm just waiting for my opportunity to do so. My own read of China is a little different now, that China in the last 5 years or so has been much more assertive about trying to advance territorial claims in a number of different places. Right? And it's had exactly the reaction you would expect. It's made the Vietnamese more worried, it's made the Philippines more worried, it's made Malaysia more worried, it's made Japan more worried, etc. And that's, I think, a different situation. So each small country has to sort of decide, how serious the problem is and what its different possible options are. And the Swiss example is instructive, right? Making yourself hard to swallow is not a bad thing.
How do they make themselves hard to swallow?
Really, well, a variety of things. One is, they had this very well-developed civil defense thing. Every Swiss household had guns in it. Yeah. They were worse than the United States in that regard. But it was all
Second Amendment.
It was all done unlike the United States, it was done in the context of a well-regulated militia. Right, as this
everyone has guns because everybody has to do money for service.
That's right. The second thing that they had done things like a lot of the tunnels and bridges were essentially set up so they could be blown up very quickly. And the idea was, you can come in, but it's not going to be easy to get through the place. You're trying to go from France to Italy, and we're just in the way. We'll make that hard for you. You're just better off. Cost benefit, you're just better off leaving us alone, and there are some benefits to leaving us alone. Whatever war you're currently in may need to get settled at some point. You're going to need some place to hold those negotiations. Why not us? Nice lakes, nice hotels, and we're not on anybody's side. And most of you have parked your money here anyway. The Swiss were very, calculating and did some, by the way, some pretty reprehensible things along the way. So I'm not an enormous defender of the Swiss moral position, but given where they were located, it is a strategy that worked reasonably well for them. If you can't get a really powerful country to be your protector, right, then you have to.
So you were saying that years ago, Russia had no intention to have some intervention in Ukraine, but right now it's big.
Yeah.
So what would happen for the global geopolitics after Ukraine event?
I think a lot depends on how it gets resolved. And one of the tricky parts in any any part of international diplomacy is if once two large countries are at odds, in a sense, it's hard to solve it if either side is going to feel really humiliated. In a sense, you have to construct a deal that allows both sides to at least pretend that they got something out of it. So I do think, the only big card we have to play is some kind of formal assurance on Ukrainian neutrality. And suppose we were willing to say to Putin, if you'll get out of Crimea, we will sign an agreement. We'll do this in full publicity. We'll get the head of the Secretary General of the UN. We'll get the Prime Minister of Ukraine to sign it too. We're all going to agree to this in public that Ukraine is going to be a neutral state going forward, but you've got to get out of Crimea. And he might come back and say, first you sign the paper, then I'll get out of Crimea. And we have to work out details here. But that's, I think, the biggest card we have to play.
Julie's husband, she's a violinist, and she performed early on. I'm a neuroscientist, physicist, and hanger-on in this.
Isn't everybody?
My name is Bill Mitchell. I'm a journalist. I met Tuan at the Shorenstein Center. I was a fellow there several years ago, and Carol and I just moved to Boston. And excuse us if we leave a bit early because we returned from 3 weeks in Vietnam just last night. So,
good morning to you.
It's coming up on dawn.
Yeah, good morning. And you're from Alabama, correct? Or is it Mississippi originally?
Maybe.
Yeah, somewhere south, right?
Yes, I'm from Vietnam. I'm also Harvard alumni here. I just finished my doctoral degree at the design school, and right now I'm doing my postdoc there. But before that, I am an MBA degree at the Harvard School. Yeah.
Well, let's mix it up a little bit before we go to you and, of course, our star. On the video, fill us in.
Yes. Now I think
Magnum PI?
no, Alex Patakos. You can hear me. Yeah, you hear me? Yeah, I hear you. Now I think not the meaning. Yeah,
you do it very clearly. Sorry, Miss Stevens. I was able to listen, but I felt a little bit like a member of the NSA watching you guys from the distance, because I could watch the entertainment drivers behind collaboration. The first one is frequency of contact. I mean, collaboration is a contact sport. If we don't communicate, whether it's like this, virtually, or whether it's in person, various ways, we have a lot more ways to stay in contact with each other now than we ever did before. If we don't stay in contact and increase the frequency, we don't know what people are thinking. We don't know what people are doing. And that's been a real problem. Transparency, obviously, is an issue related to that. The second main driver of collaboration that we've learned over, again, probably 50 years worth of research is creating and critical awareness of interdependence. Many times we think we're alone. We think we have all the answers. We think we have all the power, the influence. And so the idea is that part of our mission as collaborators, mission as advancers of peace, is really trying to show that we are interconnected, that we are interdependent. And then the third thing, which is very difficult to do, and Stephen touched on this as well, is that how do we create mutual benefit when we try to find a solution? And it means we have to give up things. Right? Again, you can't go to common ground unless you're willing to go to higher ground. That's a major dimension. And then the third quick pathway, which Tuan knows this is near and dear to my heart, is how do we advance innovation, creative thinking. A large part of what Steve was talking about is that in the Ukrainian situation, this is true so many other situations I've seen around the world, is that we're not very creative about, coming up with innovative solutions. Right? It's my way or the highway kind of a thing. And the idea behind innovation, actually, my wife wrote an excellent book called The Seeds of Innovation, really requires 4 key components. Obviously, there's have to be creativity. We have to come up with new ideas. And we can facilitate that process. But secondly, we have to make sure that we agree on the strategy. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? What's the purpose? Thirdly, how do we implement this thing? We don't spend time implementing it. Somebody's leading you on it. You guys are leading already.
More
Can you hear me?
They just got back from Vietnam. They just got back from Vietnam yesterday, so it's morning.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Well, we give an excuse here. We're not going to get an anchor
Seriously
course.
jet lagged.
So they have to have implementation capacity. And then fourthly, there has to be some sort of value added. If we don't have those four criteria, if we don't meet those four criteria, we don't have authentic innovation. And so one of the things, we have all these crazy creative ideas, and then we kind of leave it. So my last point here, that really integrates this, is that the key to our educational process, the key to our processes related to any sort of political science-oriented conflict resolution has to focus on meaning. And that's a piece that somehow we seem to lose. You know, again, I'll give you two other quick quotes from my Greek heritage, my Greek ancestors, one's from Pythagoras. He said, the beginning of every government starts with the education of our youth. We should be spending time teaching people what is it that drives them. What are the things that allow us to collaborate with each other? What are the core values that are actually humanistic and that actually do provide a foundation for peaceful interaction? And then the second one is from Aristotle's Politics. He said, a state's purpose is not merely to provide a living, but to make a life that is good. And we don't seem to spend the time doing that because, again, look at the confidence that we have in our public institutions. The United States, I mean, they're taking a major dive. And I've seen this go through cycles, you know, and we did the same thing right after Carter when Reagan came into office. We can see the same issues that we see today in many respects. And I think that the idea is that the search for meaning has to become a megatrend of the 21st century. And we need to kind of explore through authentic dialogue how we can together work on trying to find a common purpose. And I spend my life doing this. This is, you know, I'm very blessed because I'm standing on the shoulders of Victor Frankl. If you're not familiar with his work, I highly recommend you do it. Obviously, I highly recommend you read Prisoners of Our Thoughts, because just on the title of my book, Prisoners of Our Thoughts, that gives you an idea, because I know everybody in this room knows somebody who's been a prisoner of their thoughts. And we certainly are seeing a lot of prisoners in our political institutions. So I'll open it up to questions if anybody is interested. Otherwise, I hope you can grab dessert, because I can't have any.
May I? One, I think Tuan very well put, because a key issue that I find, and I run a nonprofit that we deal with 51 countries, and religion, metaphysics, the understanding of why does someone think the way they think, to me is the most fascinating part of what I do. And to know that there's someone like you that is dedicating your life to thinking that process is fascinating. An interesting thing that I found, I happen to be Catholic, right-wing Republican Catholic, okay, so I'm the oddball here in the room. But a really interesting thing that happened before the occupation of Crimea was that there was a real groundswell for Russia's resurgence of the faith among the Catholic community. Because there was a vision of Fatima, okay, for a lot of people who don't have the background, that there was an apparition, a vision of Our Lady, the belief is in the Catholic faith, and Pope John Paul was big on this, that one of the visions was that Russia would reclaim its faith. Now, pretty interesting little fact that I read just today, this morning. In all the wars, Russia has, even through communism, they have an icon, I think they call it the Black Virgin Mary. Maybe she's in black or over something, I don't actually know, I just read it this morning. But this article claimed that in all the wars they would always put it wherever the battles were. And supposedly Putin had it flown over the Crimea. Now, you know, I wasn't there, I don't know. But this is a really big thing. Why do I say that? In America, the thing that everybody ridiculed Putin, and NBC did their best propaganda with, is the gay rights issue. This is an issue that in America, it was just a de facto. He's nuts. He's not, even Bill O'Reilly. The guy's nuts. He's not pro-gay. Why? Because of the way they see it from their religion, where they are in their faith. And so this is the way Russia sees the West, is that it's morally bankrupt. It's lost its faith. Certainly many could argue Europe has lost its faith, its Christian faith. Christian faith in America is taking a big hit. So I think Russia sees its identity, and for me that's staggering. I'm a generation, I think, older than you, right? Where's the camera, by the way? The camera on the TV? Okay, so I'll look on the Mac, so it looks like I'm looking at it.
There you go.
I'm a generation. But I wanted your thoughts on how you see the intersection of all these topics and religion to be as fascinating.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you make a good point. I happen to be Greek Orthodox. All right, and a large part, and Putin is obviously
very close.
Strong of the Russian Orthodox faith. And he's one of the reasons that Russia actually has a fairly decent relationship with Greece right now is because of their common faith.
Which is mandated, by the way. Which he's mandated. What he's done is he said to the oligarchs, or not the oligarchs, the biggest rich people in each city, rebuild your cathedrals, rebuild your churches. And he mandates them to redo them all across Russia.
Right. You know, but it's interesting you talk about the media, because obviously the media can play either side, rarely both sides, fairly. But the idea of looking at Putin from a faith-based perspective, you wouldn't do that if you look at the Nation of Islam and how they perceive, for example, homosexuality, because that's not politically correct. And so the idea of attacking Putin for those reasons, to me, is very short-sighted, and it also doesn't achieve the end goals of what hopefully all of us want to do in terms of the world in which we tolerate each other and we can actually live in peace.
Well said.
I'm glad I had somebody in the room that thought it was well said.
Yeah.
The others were asleep.
No, they're awake.
But now I would like to hear Julia. Julia to play and violin. Great.
Okay, we'll
Play like you're at the Santa Fe Opera. We all should be in the spring.
There we go. First I have to wash my hands, so a little more conversation while
So by the way, what brought you to Santa Fe? I'm a Lobo. I played college football for the University of New Mexico. That's my academic background before I got in the Harvard orbit.
You have to be kidding me.
No, I'm a Lobo. Yeah.
Okay, I'm a UNM alum as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So you would have been there when Stan Quintana, do you remember him? He was the quarterback in, early 70s maybe, something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What a small world.
Yeah. I got there when they were, remember when they were 10-1 in the early 80s? I came and then it went downhill.
Went down from there.
It went down from there when I came. Yeah.
So we're listening to some music here now?
Momentarily. But there's one person that introduced himself.
I'm Jonas Brunschwig. I work with MIT during the day, raising funds. Happen to be from Switzerland, so.
Well, everybody hates the Swiss. You're too damn neutral.
Well, I'm not neutral, but I belong to the Swiss misunderstanding by birth.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, can't change that.
From where in Switzerland?
I grew up in the Italian part, but I'm originally from Zurich, so I didn't belong to either part, which is a good place to be. Gives you a good outsider view.
Well, I mean, I think having spent a very brief time with the ousted president and with the Russians in my previous iteration, the nonprofit started at the Kennedy School, and we hosted the biggest summit between U.S. and Russia. So I spent a lot of time with the Russians, only about 3 or 4 times with Putin. But I think what's interesting is I once heard a very prominent official in the Russian government say to me back about 10 years ago, we were hosting the Russian event, and the day before we were going to host a U.S.-Ukrainian investment symposium, and we did. And I asked him to come, and he said, I don't want to come. And I said, why not? And he said, well, you don't understand. And I was new to the game, so he forgave me a little bit. He said, for us, this Orange Revolution is them going away from us. That would be like Florida celebrating their going away from America towards Cuba. You know, it just doesn't make sense to us. And when I, have seen what's been happening, that just resonates with me. And quite frankly, they've done a horrible job, I think, of communicating that to the world, of how much it means to them. It's almost like the girl you really wanted to ask out, and then she gets married, and you make a movie out of it by saying, gosh, I really wanted to marry you. Well, you should have said something. And so unless they've been doing this through diplomatic channels that none of us are aware of, they've done a horrible job of communicating how much that means to them to have a buffer zone, if that's really what the issue is. And in typical Russian form, when they make a decision to do something, they do it in a gigantic testosterone way, you know? So I think Steve had some interesting points. We're going to have to get to the core of why they're doing it, get them to recognize they're in there. That'd be a good start, right? Because I think, I don't know, I haven't checked recently. Have they admitted those are Russian troops yet or not?
I don't think so. No.
No? So, you know, we got to get them to say, okay, those are our guys, put their patches on, and then try to talk about what they want and how they're going to respect the integrity, because there's no question that they're in there. So I think they're going to have to find a diplomatic solution. Even as a right-wing Republican, I don't see a military option. I just don't think there's a military option here. So I think it's got to be diplomatic.
One is about economic. We cannot do it don't work with Russia because they inability. They don't worry about that. And diplomats, they don't want to. They don't enter to negotiate.
I mean, the economic certainly. Economics has been used in warfare for a long time. I just so happen to be of the belief that back to your point on dialogue, look in the camera over here, back to your point on dialogue.
Difficult to dialogue because a big country don't want to dialogue. They want to.
But they, when we hosted them, they wanted to engage. The only thing that they hated was when America lectured to them. The thing that was fascinating to me that a Russian once said, they're on dog years, right? So to us, we would meet once a year and we would try to bring this brilliant Harvard professor and that one. Well, they'd already read 10 of the books from those people. So they were like, what do you got next? That's it. You know, they were in such a hunger for knowledge to learn the way the global game worked that they were 7 times faster at us than these things. And so the best chance that we've had is by doing business with them, getting in there, helping them build their economy, letting them feel that they do have a stake in the globe. So I think those have been very, very productive things for Russia and has helped America. So, you know, can we use that economic hammer? Clearly. They, of course, feel they can clearly use the Gazprom hammer, which I'm sure everybody's talked about before I was here. You know, hopefully this will get, you know, Europe to realize they should look for some of the shale underneath their own nose, right? Everybody should try to get more energy independent, whether that's through alternative energies or, you know, traditional shale. You know, every country needs to not have that as a risk of conflict.
I think you make a good point on trying to understand, because Europe and the U.S. understand the economic implications very well. The EU particularly, because it has a much bigger trading relationship with Russia, whereas the U.S. has not such an important
Very
one.
small.
But at the same time, you have Angela Merkel saying about Putin that the guy is thinks in a completely different way. That just shows that they understand that they don't understand how they think.
Yeah, I mean, if he's saying they might not be ours, I mean, who knows what he said to her, but
she pretty openly admitted that this guy, there is no common ground in the way we see things, and they have a hard time.
No, I think she was referring more to his denial of certain things, I think is what I heard, right? I mean, I think she was referring to that. But the Germans, more than anybody, are really engaged in Russia and have deep ties. Their former chancellor is on the board of one of the Russian companies. They have deep ties in Russia. So I don't know how much Europe is going to have a stomach for big sanctions. They're the ones that are going to have to take the brunt of it. I don't know how much they're going to.
And if they want to go big sanctions, Russia has the ability to take a bigger hit because they care more about it.
Well, no. Russia's very fragile, and quite frankly, I don't know if we want to cripple them that way. I mean, this is a, you know, I mean, I think it's got to be diplomatic and it's got to be fairly soon. And as Stephen said, I think we've got to give Putin a chance to look good. Clearly, he wanted to do that with Syria, right? He had a vested interest to back the guy that he had there, and he, you know, looked fairly good on the global stage, right? He's kind of hurt his image a little bit with this, but And hopefully he'll come back to that frame of mind where he wants to be a global statesman, not to be seen as a dictator as many of the media portray.
I think that in this case, if we look at the level of countries, there would be no winner. In this case, all loser, as US, Europe, and Russia.
No, I mean, I think if we say there's a buffer zone, and that, I mean, I think Steve makes a good point. I mean, I think saying there's a buffer zone, recognizing that we understand this is a big issue for Russia now, trying to get them to articulate that's their point would be something they should probably try to do, not through military force. And then get them to the negotiating table to say, okay, if you want a buffer zone, here's how we could handle it, and jointly build Ukraine. And what's in it for Ukraine is if you have Russia and the West trying to help them build their economy, you know, they've got decades to catch up. I mean, they've got decades to catch up on their economy. And they've got brilliant, brilliant people, but for some reason when they go into the border, the systems are such that it hurts them. So, you know, if you can take whatever's good in Russia and bring it into Ukraine, whatever's good in the West and bring it in, that's the best chance.
I think that in the situation of Ukraine, we know that they have two parts, right? The West, I think this part would like to go to the West, and the other, because I think the main issue of Ukraine, because their internal issues, not external, right?
Well, right now it's external.
Yeah, but I think initially, internal, right?
Yeah.
And then when such situation happens, if we look at internal country, no country win, but there's somebody win, especially Putin. I think the big winner. In this case, but maybe not good for Russia, because this event may destroy the Russian economy quicker.
Yeah, I think they see that now. I mean, they understand very well that they would be on the bad, you know, end of it, even though they could hurt energy certainly. But you know, maybe I'm just an optimist, as you say you are, and believe that you know, they can be talked into doing what's right. I mean, they're not. What's the word I'm looking for? They understand right from wrong, right? They're not. I don't know what the clinical term would be. They're not psychopaths. I mean, they understand.
Do you see from the counterparts that willingness to make them understand?
I have. You mean from the U.S. side?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, look, the positive of Obama, he's not Clinton in that he doesn't want to feel, he can't feel your pain, but he's smart enough to know someone has another side, and he doesn't have that what's the word I'm looking for? As he's proven with Syria and others, he's willing to move off the machismo position, which many would argue that's hurt our country, because fear was a good negotiating stick. What was it? Teddy Roosevelt said, walk softly, carry a big stick. He's kind of saying, oh, don't worry, I won't use the stick. I love you, let's talk. You know, might not work in all cases, but, you know, certainly Russia is their default position is they might have a twig, but they're going to tell you it's a stick, and they'll kill you with the twig. So, I mean, I think the styles, it could work. It could work. He just has to elevate his game to realize the people that he's dealing with in Russia are very smart and very street smart, really, right? And he seems more like he's a Harvard guy, and he's up against somebody that's very street smart. And I think that's the mismatch right now.
Well, I mean, obviously it's difficult. I mean, the key again to me, and again, we may have passed some milestones so that we're not going to be able to do some things that I wish we could have done a while back. But we still need to open up the avenues for communicating. And I think some of the comments that I'm listening to about really not seeing Russia as being this monolithic evil monster is one way to start. And that's part of the issue. It's my way versus the highway on the Putin side, it's the same on the U.S. side. Until we get to the point where we can start to see a better understanding of each other, and in some cases, some compassion for the other side's viewpoint, we're never going to engage in any sort of meaningful connection, meaningful dialogue. And so that's going to be, to me, one of the most important things. And what I'm seeing, so far is, again, where we don't even, I think we have a trade too, in some respects, under the current way that we're approaching things. And we're setting these red lines and all these other things. We're not really able to articulate what those things really mean and follow through with them. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that means that we need to resort more to authentic conversations. But until we can get people to the table, I think there's an opportunity. Maybe we need to send Dennis Rodman over there.
Well, no, I think there were bad things that happened after, wasn't it? Did he kill his what was his aunt's? Did he kill his? It was his father's brother. Who was it again? No, his uncle.
Yeah, his uncle.
Did he kill him before or after Rodman came? I forget. You know what I'm talking about? Was it after?
I don't remember the timetable on that.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, and on Russia's side.
Lady Gaga.
Yeah. And on Russia's side, I mean, they're like an alcoholic that's not admitting they're an alcoholic. I mean, those aren't our troops. What? I mean,
Yeah.
So I mean,
it's true.
It's not just dialogue on our side. They got to step forward and say, okay, here's what we've done and why, and articulate what they're doing and why, and make their case. Put it on them.
Yeah, because he is an executive director of Grand Science Center of Harvard. So, you think Grand Science can help a bit? So,
we have nothing to say about these kinds of problems.
Yeah.
So I guess the question to you is, they say that music makes the brain better in a certain development, right? That Einstein developed this. So what do you got? Is that how you develop your brain because of your wife? Was that? That's what my wife says, at least.
That also is probably not true, but music is still wonderful for our brains, but not because it makes us smarter or anything like that, unfortunately. Nor does neuroscience have anything deep to say about resolving conflicts, unfortunately. I mean, we have a burgeoning notions of how these systems might work and how they might go awry, but I don't think it's at the stage where there's any practical implications.
Wouldn't you love to have a trial with one of those, hats with all the little connectors on Putin right now? Wonder what he's thinking. That would be good, wouldn't it, Doc?
Well, what would be really interesting is in this conversation about how people think differently and how important it is to try to understand that different kind of thinking, all that is in that, the history, the place, where the culture, the religion, all these variables, and does it look different in the brain? I mean, are different parts firing because of different cultures and different history and different, I don't know. I mean, chemically, it.
We don't have much. We don't have much. There's not much science on that. There's a little bit, but it tends to be more the flavor of if you look at the development of the way the brain processes arithmetic in infants here and in Brazil or something like that. So there's a little, just tiny attempts to do that sort of thing, but nothing. It doesn't come close.
They found on the MRIs a little soccer ball in Brazilian.
And basically, no particular difference.
Yeah. all of South America, I would think that soccer ball, and Europe too.
Everywhere except this country, you can see
Come right at 5 p.m. That's what some.
But if I can say something, besides looking at neuroscience as maybe one avenue for understanding human behavior, I think we also really need to look at not just the differences culturally, psychologically, and so forth, but what are, more importantly, the similarities, the commonalities that we have. And be able, all human beings like to get, be respected. They want to receive some sort of positive, affirmative feedback. And I'll give you an example. What have you heard about the Sochi Olympics since they were completed? We heard everything up to the Olympics, the opening ceremony. We heard all the negativity. We heard about hotels and groundwater and everything else. But they did get off relatively unscathed, and the athletes, enjoyed it. It was a good experience, and it was an opportunity to bring the world together. As really, that's the purpose of the Olympic Games. And yet, nobody that I know of has really come out publicly to acknowledge that the Russians pulled it off. I mean, obviously, it wasn't as good as the Athens Olympics. But yeah, the idea
nor is historic, right?
So anyway, just throwing that out there, that there are things that bring us together, and I just hope that we look at differences. Again, Stephen Covey once said that difference is the beginning of synergy. And we really need to think about how do we create synergies and how do we really leverage any differences in a positive way by also looking at the commonalities that we all have as human beings. And that's a metaphysical dimension that oftentimes we ignore. And that's the part that I hope that, we don't all have to become, the Dalai Lama or Nelson Mandela or whatever to...
I'd say the Pope. Go ahead, sorry.
No, so I guess it's food for thought in terms of how do we connect with people meaningfully. I'll never forget this, my last thing, because I've got to go here too, and I don't know how much longer you're going to go, but when my book Prisoners of Our Thoughts came out in hardcover, it was right after the Asian tsunami. And the first application of my book was to help train volunteer aid workers in Banda Aceh, Indonesia. And, the fact is that the book is about meaning. It wasn't about going into a Muslim country and trying to convert them to Christianity or anything else. It was about helping them find meaning in their ordeal and in horrific circumstances. And it was to help the volunteer aid workers understand a deeper meaning. Because if you haven't been to a place with such chaos, such horrific consequences, in this case a natural disaster, it's very difficult to deal with. What's the meaning of this? And so I think that meaning is a bridge. And if we can respect each other as human beings, as human spirits, and foster a deeper sense, a deeper connection to the core of meaning, we can go a lot further to advance the peace cause. Anyway, that's my political statement.
This is an example of a very personal relationship that I had with a wonderful photographer named Arnold Newman. Arnold Newman was called an environmental photographer. He did things with Stravinsky, with Picasso, and in his early days, when he was with Life magazine, went to Germany and photographed Alfred Krupp. Now, Krupp was an industrialist who worked in Nazi Germany and built all of Hitler's tanks and many of his heavy armament. I don't believe he went to Nuremberg, or if he did, he was acquitted. But in the early 50s, Arnold decided he would take this photograph, which the authorities didn't know about. He took it in such a way that Krupp looks like the devil. There he is posed in front of his factory. And this image was at first not published because of the fear of the magazine editors, but after that became world known. It was one image that talked about a man and what he did that was promoting a horrific, helping to promote a horrific war. These examples of images and what they can do to enhance discussion of past problems and perhaps prevent future problems.
All right, to conclude, thank you for having been with us thus far, and now to conclude the event, we're going to ask Julie to play us another piece of music as a memorial for the victims of unjust acts of war, as the case of the Spratly Islands in 1988, or as in the case of the invasion of Georgia by Russia, or the current occupation of the Ukraine. So, to conclude this, final piece of music from Julie. Thank you for being with us, and have a good night.